Howdy again everyone, and today I'm continuing to check out a whole set of cine lenses that 7Artisans have just put to market called their INFINTE series, not Infinity, INFINTE. They come in this rather huge box of 7 of them at a price of $5,523 US, or they can be purchased individually for between $720 and $800 each. The 16mm lens is the exception though at $890 US. They're also available in black or white. They are full frame, totally manual lenses for PL and Canon EF mounts, so they can be adapted easily onto your mirrorless camera system. Today I'll be testing them adapted onto my Canon EOS R5. Last time I looked at the 24, 35 and 50mm lenses. Today I'll be checking out the 16, 85, 105 and 135mm optics. So that's an ultra-wide lens and 3 portrait or subject lenses. The 16mm lens's maximum aperture is t2.5, the 135mm lens goes as bright as t2.4, the other two lenses are t2.1. I'd like to thank 7Artisans very much for sending me these lenses for evaluation, although as usual this is a totally independent review. As I mentioned before, I personally love the aesthetic design of these lenses. I think they look great. They're quite a classy design and, of course, it's always helpful to have the focal length printed on the lens cap. Those are slip-on lens caps by the way, but they do stay on quite nice and securely. When mounted onto your camera, the left of the lens shows the focal point in meters, and to the right of the lens shows it in feet and inches, and shows the aperture as well. It might have been nice to have aperture markings on the left side as well. Each of the lenses are made of metal and feel very solid, with a fair bit of weight to them too, each weighing about 1 kilogram or a bit over 2 pounds. The rest of the text and markings on the lens's barrels has been properly etched into the metal and filled in with paint, even down to the serial numbers, and all 7 of the lenses have their geared aperture and focus rings in the same size and location for easy interchangeability. They're all based on solid metal lens mounts with 6 screws holding them in place but no weather sealing. Their aperture rings all turn beautifully smoothly, but my complaint is that they're not evenly spaced. Once you stop down to T16 or T22, the setting gets really fiddly, which is kind of a pain. On all 3 of the lenses, the focus rings also turned extremely smoothly, with very long focus throws to them, which is obviously ideal for video work. Let's take a look at focus breathing then. On a 16mm lens, breathing is pretty noticeable actually, but in fairness, you don't tend to do big focus pulls while shooting with ultra-wide angle lenses, so hardly an issue. Here's the good news, the 85mm lens and the 105mm lens both show almost no breathing at all, and that's more important as it's more likely you'll be focusing those things in and out. If we switch over to the 135mm lens, you can notice just a small amount of breathing, but only if you look really quite closely, so this is a very good result. Overall, I've handled other lower budget cine lenses which perform worse than this. The lenses don't come with hoods, but they do each have 82mm filter threads, although the 16mm lens is 86mm wide, by the way, a little wider, but the rest of the lens is still consistent with its brothers. They also have double screw points at the top and bottom for mounting equipment. As I mentioned in the last video, the box they come in is of just an average quality. I had to snip a bit from the foam topping with scissors to get the 16mm lens to fit in correctly, then glue it all back down again. But it's tough enough to do the job, has roller wheels and has extra room inside for your camera, a heavy duty adapter and a couple of filters. All in all, apart from my mild complaints about the aperture ring, everything is absolutely fine here, and its build quality is only a few steps away from the professional gear. It's also good to see that low focus breathing. So let's look at image quality. I'll be testing them today adapted onto my Canon EOS R5 with its 45 megapixel full frame sensor. No in-camera corrections are available with these lenses. And a brief reminder, 4K video only needs about 8 megapixels of resolution and 8K video needs about 32 megapixels. Anyway, at their respective maximum apertures, we're on a bit of a roller coaster ride of different sharpness and contrast levels. The 16mm lens shows a slightly soft image with noticeable blue colour fringing, but its contrast is very good. The 85mm lens is sharper, but its contrast is surprisingly low. But the 105 and 135mm lenses both look great, although the 135mm lens still has slightly lower contrast. Or just look at the test images there, you'll see what I mean. If you stop down to t2.8, the wider lenses get a touch sharper, but all four lenses maintain their same contrast or lack of. Stop down again to t4, and all four lenses are now very sharp in the middle, but all four continue with their contrast patterns, even if you stop down further. I'll also note here that the 16mm lens also seemed to have slightly cooler colours than the other three. Anyway, let's open them back up to their brightest apertures and take a look over in their image corners. Okay, the 85mm lens is looking excellent here, and the 135mm lens very good. The 105mm lens is a little softer but still pretty nice, but the 16mm lens is lagging behind. Well, hardly surprising I suppose, as ultra-wide is a bit more of an ambitious design. Stop down to t2.8 to see, well, not much difference frankly. At t4, the 16, 105 and 135mm lenses all see improvements, and t5.6 is as sharp as they get. Alright, so the 105 and 135mm lenses are performing well. The 85mm lens is quite sharp too, but it seems to have a contrast problem, at least in the middle of its images anyway. Still, that can be corrected quite easily. The 16mm lens is comparatively soft. You can use it for 4K video footage at t2.5 if you don't mind slightly soft corners, but really you should stop it down to about t5.6 if you want a really punchy image. Okay, let's see about distortion and vignetting. As you might expect, the 16mm lens stands out from the others in this respect. It shows notable barrel distortion, particularly in the corners, and vignetting is heavy at t2.5. Stop down to t4 though, and those corners do brighten up noticeably. The 85mm, 105 and 135mm lenses all have a very similar characteristic. Synoptically, they each show just a touch of barrel distortion, nothing noticeable, and at their brightest apertures, only a moderate amount of vignetting. Stop down to t2.8 or t4, and their corners brighten up. So the wide-angle lens continues to struggle here, but the telephoto lenses are actually looking pretty good. Now, let's see about close-up image quality. The 16mm lens can get you down to 25cm, the 85mm lens can get you down to 85cm, and the two longer lenses can both focus down to 1 meter. The only lens in a whole set that can get you closer than that 135mm optic is the 35mm lens that I tested out in the last video. Anyway, at their closest distances and brightest apertures, all four lenses see reduced sharpness and contrast, particularly that troublesome 85mm lens. Stop them down to t2.8 for only quite marginal improvements. It's at t4 that they start getting sharp, although the 85mm lens is still lagging behind and needs to be stopped down to t5.6 for a properly sharp image, where the 135mm lens also sees another improvement. Now, let's see how well they put up with bright light. The 16mm lens gives a below average performance. We're seeing a fair variety of flaring patterns here, both in front of and behind the bright lights in question. The 85, 105 and 135mm lenses all perform quite similarly here. They too show flaring, perhaps not as much as the wide-angle lens though, but they also show quite notable and similar levels of broader glaring when bright lights are on the edge of the image or just outside of it, so you might want to consider using a matte box with those lenses for best results. Next, bokeh. On the 16mm lens, out-of-focus backgrounds are looking a little edgy, particularly with some outlining on specular highlights, but it's not disastrous. On the telephoto lenses, bokeh is looking fairly soft and pleasant to me, although on the 85mm lens, we see some green fringing on highlights. That is reduced on the 105mm lens and essentially gone on the 135mm lens. Basically, the lens's background separation looks perfectly fine here, although you can get softer with more expensive lenses. And finally, related to bokeh comes longitudinal chromatic aberration. On the 16mm optic, it's hard to spot at any aperture. On the telephoto lenses, there's quite a lot of colour fringing to bokeh highlights though. Stop down to T2.8 or T4 to see them reduced. At T5.6, they're finally gone. Overall then, the 16mm lens is optically pretty weak, but it'll still make itself useful in an emergency if you're only shooting in 4K. The 3 telephoto lenses had a number of optical problems, but they were at least quite sharp. I was a bit surprised by the contrast problems of the 85mm lens, to be honest. Perhaps I had a bad sample there or something. I do suspect as much. These were early production copies of the lenses after all. All of the lenses though do have very good build quality and low focus breathing, which are 2 of the main things you're really looking for in a cine lens. They also have a consistently low vignetting and distortion, which is very helpful as well, except the 16mm optic. I'll repeat what I said in a previous video, the lens's prices seem expensive and that 16mm lens here is overpriced. But you must remember that, generally, cine lenses like this are much more expensive to make because they're physically bigger, have much better build quality than most stills lenses, and you're getting their low focus breathing and interchangeable sizes, which are highly valued by many video makers. Also, they're not a mass market product, so there are obviously much lower economies of scale on the manufacturer's part. If you're on the market for a set of cine lenses like this, then they're not a bad option.